There have been many all-time classic races at Canada in Formula One, so the vote for which one we gave this special retrospective review was always going to be a close one. I did not expect it to be as close as it was though. Gilles Villeneuve's home race win in 1978, Lewis Hamilton's first Formula One victory in 2007, and Jenson Button's incredible comeback in 2011 all came close, but it's the birthday boy Jean Alesi that I am picking for this special look. Back in 1995 he won his only Formula One race ever. It's 30 years since that happened, so I thought now was as good a time as any to look back at the 1995 Canadian Grand Prix. But how did he do it? Well, let's dive in. Let's find out how Jean Alesi won his only ever Formula One race pretty much 30 years to the day since it happened. So the Canadian Grand Prix was round 6 of 17 in the 1995 season, and just like in 1994, it was looking like it was going to be a battle between Michael Schumacher and Damon Hill for the World Championship. After the previous round at Monaco, Schumacher got the better of Hill, despite Hill starting from pole position during that race. Hill would never win around Monaco, despite being the son of Graham Hill, Mr. Monaco, who of course won 5 times in the Principality. Schumacher dominated the event in 1995 though, making it back-to-back wins in the Principality after he also won in 1994. And that opened up his lead in the championship to 5 points ahead of Damon Hill heading into the next round in Montreal. The two Ferraris of Gerhard Berger and Jean Alesi were in 3rd and 4th overall, with Schumacher's Benetton teammate Johnny Herbert 5th in the standings. Ferrari were having a bit of a revival in 1995 as the Dream Team was beginning to be assembled. Jean Todt was already at the team, but the likes of Michael Schumacher and Ross Brawn were yet to join the outfit, but of course that would happen in the coming years. But in terms of their overall pace in 1995, that car was nowhere near as fast as the Williams or the Benetton. Although in the Constructors' Championship it was actually pretty tight, just 5 points separating Benetton, Williams and Ferrari, basically due to the second drivers for Williams and Benetton not at this stage getting on top of their cars, these being Johnny Herbert, who I mentioned before, and also David Coulthard, who had made his debut in Formula One for Williams the year prior. Basically, the experience of Berger and Alesi kept Ferrari in with an outside shot of winning the Constructors' Championship, although they had to get some wins on the board. But they wouldn't have to wait too much longer for one of those. But speaking of long dry spells in Formula One, it cannot be overstated how bad Ferrari were in the early 1990s. 1990 being the exception to this, of course. Alain Prost going to a title challenge, only just losing out to his great rival Ayrton Senna at the Japanese Grand Prix that year. That is a future race that I will cover another time. Don't you worry about that. I did cover the 89 Japanese Grand Prix the other day, so check that out if you've not already. Of course, really would appreciate it. But after that, after 1990, it was really, really disastrous. In 1991, the car was a truck, or at least that's what Alain Prost thought, and he very much made those feelings known, saying it to the press and getting sacked from the team for 92. But the team very much went on a downward spiral after that. Despite talented drivers such as Jean Alesi and Gerhard Berger, they had to wait all the way until 1994. Where Berger managed to win the German Grand Prix. He was very much a specialist around the Hockenheim ring, was Berger. Indeed, he'd win his final ever Grand Prix in 1997 at the same circuit. Interestingly as well, on top of that, Berger also became the guy to win the first and final Grand Prix for Benetton, winning the 1986 Mexican Grand Prix for the team in his first stint with the outfit, and then returning later on and winning the final ever race in 97. Really weird position, but that was Gerhard Berger in a nutshell, to be honest. But yeah, almost 4 years between Alain Prost winning at the Spanish Grand Prix in 1990 and Berger winning around the Hockenheim ring in 1994. People complain about Ferrari's form nowadays, and rightfully so, but my god, that was an absolutely horrific spell for Ferrari. So things were looking up for 1995, but like I said, they needed to get a win on the board. And Alesi too, he needed to get a win on the board. He'd never won in Formula One, despite being pretty much well regarded at this point as being one of the most talented drivers in F1. And we saw this really early on as well. He burst onto the scene with Tyrrell in 1989, and in particular in 1990, where they had the absolute audacity to challenge the great Ayrton Senna around Phoenix and dice with him for the lead during the United States Grand Prix of that year. That announced him to the world stage and basically earned him a move to Ferrari for 1991. Although interestingly, he could have chosen to join Williams for 91, and had his head prevailed over his heart, we could be talking about someone who easily could have won at least one, maybe two world championships. So dominant was the Williams in the early 1990s. He definitely would have won a lot more races than just the one that he ended up getting, of course. Would have been fascinating to see how he'd get on alongside Prost at Williams and also Nigel Mansell at Williams as well, but we'll never know because he went with his heart. He went to Ferrari. The little boy was very much telling him where to go on this one, and even though he was French, he was known as the French-Sicilian, a lot of family connections to Italy, so really for him, it wasn't really a choice. He was always going to go to Ferrari when they came calling. The 95 was seeming like a decent year for Alesi so far. He came close to getting victory in both the San Marino and the Argentine Grand Prix early in 95, finishing second place in both of them. By this point, he amassed 15 podiums without taking a victory in Formula 1, which is still a joint record to this day, held with Patrick Depailler, Mika Hakkinen, Eddie Irvine, and a certain Lando Norris, who all took to the podium 15 times before getting their first victory in F1. So let's talk about the race weekend itself, and there was drama even before we started racing because safety was one of the big topics heading into the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve. Yes, the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve is still the host of the Canadian Grand Prix to this day, but back in the mid-90s the track was vastly different in a lot of ways to what it is now. The layout was almost identical aside from the final sector, where instead of having a very long straight from the hairpin all the way to the Wall of Champions chicane, there were actually two chicanes that were on this part. There was always one on that straight before this, but they added a second one for 1994 as part of the rather knee-jerk reaction to increased safety in the wake of both Senna and Roland Ratzenberger's deaths at the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix. But it wasn't just that, it was also the bumpiness of the track as well. This, of course, being effectively a street circuit, so it was not the most leveled out and smooth track. Nowadays, it very much is, but back then, the surface at Canada was always a big talking point. And in fact, even I can remember in my day when I was first starting watching Formula 1 in the late 2000s, I still remember there being loads of cement dust on the outside of a lot of corners, and that very much causing havoc with drivers. I think, was it Felipe Massa who pulled off a double overtake because two drivers ahead of him basically went onto the cement dust, basically greased ice, to paraphrase Martin Brundle, and he just ended up sweeping down the inside of him. The surface at Canada was always a big problem before the 2010s, but thankfully those days are now gone. However, 30 years ago it was very much the forefront of conversation, and the GPDA basically wanted to put in a ban on overtaking heading into the new chicane, the first of the two chicanes after the hairpin. However, this understandably caused a lot of confusion for the drivers, not least for Michael Schumacher and Damon Hill, the two title protagonists at this point in the season. They were unsure whether that actually applied to the entire race or just to the first lap. It wasn't overly clear. But regardless, it was unsurprisingly both Hill and Schumacher on the front row with this one, with Schumacher qualifying on pole position in qualifying by over 3/10 ahead of Damon Hill. Coulthard had a good qualifying to line up on the second row in third, with the Ferraris both around half a second or more off of the leader, with Berger in P4 and Alesi in P5. And when the race started, it very much looked as though Schumacher was going to dominate here. You very much got that sense of inevitability, even at this relatively early stage in his career. Once he was out leading, he was very hard to stop, and so it was proven so far in this one. However, Alesi promised, he was saying before the race that he was going to go aggressive, he was going to leave nothing on the table, he was going to go for it, and indeed he managed to overtake Berger pretty early on to get into P4. Very shortly after that, literally through the same corner, David Coulthard ended up spinning off ahead of him to put Alesi onto the podium. And this track was an absolute absolute car killer, which we will touch on later on, of course. Alesi was quick, but he wasn't really quick enough to challenge Schumacher and Hill. However, Hill would retire on lap 50 of 68, being a gearbox issue for the British driver. Alesi was in P2, but he needed a bit of luck to get into P1. However, for once for Jean, it actually arrived. Schumacher's Benetton ran into electrical issues during this Grand Prix late on, and he was stuck in third gear. He managed to crawl it back to the pits. He had to get his steering wheel changed. The Benetton team got a little laptop computer, I suppose a rather large laptop computer back then, but a laptop to actually reboot the entire car, put all the software back in, deactivate option 13. That's just a joke, by the way. We'll talk about option 13 at some point, though, I'm sure. That was a 94 problem, not a 95 problem. But yeah, that basically cost him an absolute heap of time. He fell all the way down to P7 and out of the points. This, children, was in the days where only the top 6 scored points. Of course, nowadays the top 10. You kids in Formula 1 don't know how easy you had it. Back then you had to finish in the top 6 and only 10 points for a victory rather than 25 like nowadays. And sprint racers, forget about them. They weren't even thought about back then. Because he never saw Schumacher actually go into the pits, Alesi didn't realise he was in the lead. He only realised this was the case when he passed the pits on the following lap and saw P1 on his pit board. This is a guy who lives and breathes Ferrari. He is absolutely an ultimate fan, being part Italian, and of course he has waited such a long time to win a race. He has been so close on so many occasions. The emotion caught up with him. He almost ran out of the race into the first corner. He almost missed his braking point going into turn 1. Thankfully, though, he didn't miss his braking point. He continued and he ended up winning really comfortably in the end. A very emotional victory, winning by over 30 seconds ahead of Rubens Barrichello's Jordan. This was an extremely popular win, not least with the local fans in Canada. A lot of the Tifosi over there absolutely loving this one. They invaded the track. They were waving the Ferrari flags with the Italy shirts on. Just an iconic scene, really. And it was made all the more iconic as well because Schumacher actually picked up Jean Alesi after he ran out of fuel. Alesi running out of fuel on the cooldown lap. Back then you could do that and you wouldn't be in trouble. Nowadays he would have been in big trouble for that. But yeah, he picked him up and Alesi rode back on Schumacher's Benetton to the pits. He was waving to the crowd. He was fist bumping in the air. He was absolutely on cloud 9. Very much an everybody liked that moment in Formula 1. Even the biggest Schumacher and Hill fans, I think, would have been celebrating that one. Everybody loves Jean Alesi. This is without doubt one of the most iconic images in Formula 1 history. And again, you know, people will criticise Jean Alesi for saying, you know, he should have done more of his career. He should have gone to Williams. But, you know, and I think he'd probably say it as well. His time at Ferrari was absolutely priceless. Even to this day, he is rightfully regarded as a Tifosi legend. And that is worth almost more than anything else in Formula 1. Now, when it comes to the results for this race, it's easy to say that Alesi got lucky here, but you just think about what Alesi had been through in his entire career before this. He has very much been due this for a long time. He was also very much regarded as the Nearly man in Formula 1, the one that almost got the wins, that got podiums but never quite got it over the line, just like Lando Norris was until just over 12 months ago as well. He's far from himself in this regard, but Alesi dispelled all of that with this victory in Formula 1. Like I mentioned just before as well, this was an incredible result for the Jordan team. Rubens Barrichello getting P2, which was their highest ever finish in Formula 1 to this point, and Eddie Irvine managed to complete the podium, getting a double podium for Jordan. Their only ever podium before this being the Pacific Grand Prix in 1994, Barrichello scoring that. This is their first ever double podium, and this was very much becoming a second home for Eddie Jordan's team. 4 years earlier, they managed to score their first ever points with Andrea De Cesaris and Bertrand Gachot scoring points in 4th and 5th place during Jordan's debut season. That Jordan 191, by the way, what a car, what a beauty that was. Meanwhile, Schumacher, like I said, he did make the finish of this race, and he managed to score some points as well because Martin Brundle and Gerhard Berger crashed late on, promoting Schumacher to P5. He almost managed to get P4 ahead of Olivier Panis as well, but he just ran out of laps. And in fact, because of the fans running onto the track, they actually took the results of this race a lap early as a result. So that's why it was ran to 68 laps rather than 69. Nice. Shout out to Gianni Morbidelli as well, scoring a point in his footwork in 6th place. This was his first point of the season, but somehow he did manage to actually get a podium in the footwork at Australia in 1995 as well, although that is another story for another day. But yeah, it was very much happy birthday to Jean Alesi. His 31st birthday was an extremely happy one. He couldn't have wished for a better birthday present than getting his first win for Ferrari. As a result of this race, Alesi went into 3rd place in the standings overall, but still over a win behind Schumacher, whose lead in the championship was beginning to grow as he started to stretch his legs. Schumacher would win the 1995 championship at an absolute canter, despite coming to blows with Damon Hill at both Silverstone and also Monza as well later in the year. Ferrari now actually led the Constructors' Championship as well, although this wouldn't last much longer, and they would eventually finish in 3rd place in that year's championship. But it was a long way ahead of McLaren in 4th and showed real progress from the Scuderia. Alesi would also finish in 5th in the drivers' standings as well, being the highest placed non-Benetton and non-Williams driver, and indeed he was only just 7 points off David Coulthard, who was in 3rd overall. This win was the final one for a V12 engine in Formula 1 as well, as Ferrari wouldn't win another race in 1995, and in 1996 all of the cars would run V10 engines. Although they would come close to victory a few more times in 1995, particularly with Jean Alesi, who came close to winning the race in both the Nürburgring, the European Grand Prix I believe it was called that year. Sometimes it was called European, sometimes it was called Luxembourg, sometimes it was German, just very much what it felt like at the time, but I'm pretty sure it was European in 1995. And he also came close to winning at Monza as well, but that was a whole tragic tale for Ferrari, which I will cover no doubt another time. The 95 season, very underrated one in my opinion. Despite Schumacher being the class of the field, it was very much an entertaining season. Some of the races were absolute classics, and Canada very much comes into that category as well. In the coming years for Ferrari, all of the pieces would eventually be put in place for the Scuderia to eventually dominate the sport in the early 2000s. Michael Schumacher, of course, would join from Benetton in 1996. Ross Brawn would follow Schumacher to Ferrari from Benetton in 1997, and the likes of Jean Todt were already there. As for Jean Alesi, he would actually go the other way to Schumacher and head to Benetton for 1996, although he'd still be teammates with Gerhard Berger in 96 as both Ferrari drivers moved to Benetton. He finished 4th overall in both 96 and 97. He'd later drop into the midfield, racing for the likes of Sauber, Prost, and he eventually finished his career at Jordan in 2001, driving for his old boss in his Formula 3000 days in Eddie Jordan. Alesi would move to DTM, German touring cars, for 2002 and continue in the series until 2006. He'd later race sporadically in the likes of Le Mans Speed Car Series and a one-off appearance at IndyCar in 2012, being his final professional racing appearance. No, I am not counting the Monaco Classic in the 2020s as a professional racing appearance. That's basically a track day. Come on, let's be real here. That's a demonstration run. A great demonstration run, but a demonstration run. But a fantastic race for Jean Alesi in 1995. He's only ever winning Formula 1. Very much a man who could have and should have achieved a lot more had he moved to Williams. But like I said before, at the end of the day, he is very much a legend for Ferrari. And you can't put a price on that. Would he have won a championship with Williams? Possibly. We don't know. We'll never know. I very much think it would have been possible. He was certainly talented enough to do so, but like a lot of drivers in Formula 1, maybe not quite consistent enough to mount a serious title challenge. But that day in 1995 will live on forever for Jean Alesi, and like I said, he will remain a legend of the sport forever in the eyes of the Tifosi. But yeah, there you go guys, the 1995 Canadian Grand Prix, the one that you guys chose for this special retrospective review treatment. My next in-depth look into Formula 1 will be another conspiracy video or another scandal video, so something like Spygate or Option 13 will be in that poll. I will of course put that out early next week for you guys. And as for the 2025 Canadian Grand Prix, let's hope it's a fantastic race this weekend. Another all-time classic. Montreal always produces in Formula 1. I love this track, and this is another example of it being an absolute classic. Like, share, comment, subscribe if you want to see more of this, guys, and head over to one of the paid channels as well, the likes of Patreon or Substack, if you want to see more like this and you want to support me further. I would really appreciate it. You can also become a member on YouTube as well if you want. One. You know, you guys help me do what I love. I love doing this for my job. It doesn't even feel like a job. I'm talking about Formula One, something I, you know, talked about for decades now, and I hope you guys enjoy listening to when it comes to this, because I really do love looking at these videos. I love going through the history of Formula One and diving in and discovering something, because you always learn something as well. I didn't know that about Jean Alesi getting upset and almost spinning off at the first corner as a result. You know, these things you'll never find out unless you look up stuff like this. So yeah, see you soon, guys. Have a great weekend wherever you're in the world today, and we'll see you very soon.